Hello, everyone, and welcome to another session of Tuesday Times Roundtable. My name is Michelle Zaldivar, your Senior Program Coordinator over at the Office of Global Learning Initiatives. TTR, Tuesday Times Roundtable, is the Office of Global Learning Initiatives' flagship discussion series that brings together multiple perspectives on current global issues and trends. As we engage throughout the session, we ask that we make sure to use the microphones so that we can hear everyone and learn from everyone's perspective. That's especially true today because we have one of our panelists joining us via Zoom, and he will not be able to hear anything that is not spoken directly into a mic. So please, for consideration, and so we can hear all those perspectives, let's make sure that we use the microphones as we move around the room today. Welcome to today's session. If you haven't already, the QR code is where you can sign in. That's also posted around the room. If you're here because you want to report attendance back to a teacher for co-curricular or extended credit from your class, make sure that you tag your teacher's name in that session. As always, Tuesday Times Roundtable is linked to a New York Times article. Today's session is actually linked to an episode of The Daily, which is the New York Times daily podcast. Really great listen through all the way, about a half-hour long podcast. So not something that I'm going to encourage you to do right now. But when you're ready, you can go ahead and listen to that podcast at our Go link, go.fiu.edu/TTR1101. So that's today's date, right? 1101. If you get to that point and you hit a paywall, we have resources for you. As a member of the FIU community with an @fiu.edu email, you get a free digital subscription to the New York Times. So if you need to, once you get there, need to sign in, you can go to accessnyt.com and you can register with your FIU email. It'll ask you for your graduation year, and then you can set up your subscription. If you are a medallion student or here for an Acting Global Learning micro-credential, please make sure that you take a screenshot of the confirmation page of your sign-in so that you can put that on your points log. If you have absolutely no idea what I'm talking about when I say those things, feel free to hang out afterwards and we can talk a little more about the Excellence in Global Learning Medallion. It's a participatory program that's hosted through our office. We actually have info sessions on the first and last Wednesday of every month so we can get more resources to you. But Anna, our assistant director, you want to wave in the back? And I and Melanie, our graduate assistant, will be around after, and you're more than welcome to hang out and ask us more questions. As an extension of that, we also sponsor the Millennium Fellows on campus. One of our fellows is hosting an event between feminism and history, women in the Haitian Revolution, on November 9th from 2 to 3 p.m. If you're interested in joining that discussion, you can register at go.fiu.edu/Haitian women. And there she is. Hey, okay. So welcome to today's session, The Future Workplace, Drivers and Implications of Unionization. Our panelists today are Professor Kerri Stone. Professor Stone is a professor at the College of Law at Florida International University, where she teaches and publishes in the fields of employment law and employment discrimination, among other subjects. She is a past chair of the Association of American Law Schools section on women in legal education and has been named a top scholar by FIU. She also serves as a fellow at the U.S. Academy on Workplace Bullying, Mobbing, and Abuse at the New York University Center for Labor and Employment Law. After receiving her BA in English and Comparative Literature from Columbia, Professor Stone received her Juris Doctorate from NYU School of Law, where she was named Robert McKay Scholar. Prior to teaching here at FIU, she clerked for 3 federal judges, including 2 at the Third Circuit Court of Appeals in New York, New Jersey, and practiced law with a large firm in Manhattan before accepting her teaching fellowship at Temple University. Her published work focuses on examining anti-discrimination jurisprudence, including sexual harassment, stereotyping, and bullying. She lives in Coconut Grove with her husband, Josh, and their 2 children. Welcome, Professor Stone. Ali Bustamante, who is joining us via Zoom, is the Deputy Director of the Worker Power and Economic Security Program at the Roosevelt Institute, where he specializes on how public policy can structure markets around both economic and social values and empower Americans through the provisions of public goods and stronger labor protections. Dr. Bustamante is an expert on labor, economics, and public policy and a native Spanish speaker. His research and analysis has been featured on the New York Times, USA Today, NPR, CNN, Forbes, Charities USA's, and other media outlets. Prior to joining Roosevelt, he served as the chief economist at Louisiana Workforce Commission, senior research associate at the Southern Economic Advancement Project, and as a faculty member at our very own Florida International University, as well as the University of New Orleans and Loyola University, New Orleans. Dr. Bustamante earned his BA and PhD from the University of Miami, specializing in political economy, born in Masaya, Nicaragua, I had to switch there, and raised in Miami. He now lives in New Orleans. Martha M. Meyer, excuse me. Martha Meyer, Ed Doctorate, is a teaching professor in the Department of Educational Policy Studies at the College of Arts, Sciences, and Education. Her work centers around the context of and narratives of marginalized populations. She has been a faculty member here at FIU since 2006, and she has been president of the United Faculty of Florida, FIU, since 2020. Dr. Meyer, now I'm like switching. I am so sorry for that. Dr. Meyer comes from a long line of union members and believes deeply in the power of the collective. And our moderator today is Dr. Raquel Perez. Dr. Perez is an esteemed operational performance advisor, speaker, and educator with a PhD in conflict analysis and resolution. Dr. Perez individually advises top-tier executives and industry leaders on designing sustainable operations for their enterprises. She is especially well known for aiding resolution among competing stakeholders during high-stakes disputes, including for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and the City of Miami Police. Here at FIU, Dr. Perez is a senior faculty member with the FIU Florida Global Strategic Communications Graduate Program, Center for Labor Research Studies, CASE, and SIPA, and she worked with FIU Online to develop Online Live as an innovative online learning modality. Dr. Perez also founded her own company, Rogue Bee, that supports the advancement of minority populations in STEM. Please welcome in joining everyone on our esteemed panel.
Hi everyone, how's everyone doing?
Great.
You guys, your souls look tired. You're too young to have tired souls. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and get started. And so thank you for those that filled out the stickies on the way in. I know some of us are here because we cannot wait to hear about unions. Other rest of us, right, might be here like, the extra credit's worth it, or a great charcuterie board was happening, so here I am, right? But the idea is that we promise that by the time you leave, you will learn something that you will process, think about, and even take a look at ways that you could connect with it in your everyday life, right? So, my wonderful panel, good sir. All right, so we're gonna get started, and I have two favorites of these wonderful stickies that stood up, because one thing you'll learn rather quickly about me, I love things that are authentic and transparent, and I can connect with. And these two spoke to my soul. I have no understanding of what unions are. Are there different types of labor unions? Not really sure. So why don't we kind of start there? And as you're explaining, tell us a little bit about your journey into this whole space as well, and then answer that kind of question for us as we go. So we're going to go. Martha, would you like to go ahead?
I'd love to start. So my journey with unions started at birth. And I'm not saying that to be funny, I'm saying that because my father was an airline pilot and was a member of the Airline Pilots Union. My mother was a teacher and she was a member of United Teachers of Dade. So I grew up in a union family, and organizing was a part of my life. And I witnessed what happens when contract negotiations shut down, because my father went on strike twice in my lifetime. And there were bad results for certain people who decided to cross the picket line. If you're on strike and you do not work. And if you cross the picket line, that means you are going to work. And he had this incident where he was a captain at the time, and he was on his airplane, and he walked in, and the engineer who was sitting there had crossed the picket line and gone to work. And my father looked at him and said, "I'm not flying with you, get off my airplane." Because he was not going to work with somebody who did not understand what the power of the collective was and what the union was trying to do for everybody, not just for him. So I became a public school teacher and became a union member, and then when I moved over here to FIU, I also joined the union and was snookered, is the only word I can say, snookered into being president a couple of years, but it's been an amazing experience. So in answer to the question, that's my story. So, in answer to the question, there are different industries, and so there are different unions within those industries. So my father was an airline pilot. I'm a faculty union member. There's United Auto Workers. There are a bunch of national unions. And within those unions, there are levels, right? There's the local, there's the state, and there's the national. So you have levels in there. So I am president of UFF-FIU, United Faculty of Florida, FIU, which is the local for the United Faculty of Florida, which is the state. And then we are under AFT and NEA. So it gets really weird. It's like a family tree. So a union in and of itself is designed to provide protections for a collective. So protections don't mean you get to do whatever you do whenever you want to do it, which is sometimes the opinion of unions. You know, like, oh, that person gets to work because there's a union and they're just being protected. No, what it means is that everybody has a due process that they get to go through. And so at the end of the day, if you are accused of something or you have done something wrong, you are not immediately fired because you have a contract, and that contract spells out the things that you get to go through in order to either keep your job, or the process is going to determine whether or not you don't get to keep your job. But there is a process that you are awarded as a result of a contract that has been bargained for you. So I will pass the torch.
And before you pass the torch, because I think it's interesting in your narrative that this is something cultural in your home.
Yes.
So what does a union symbolize to you?
So a union symbolizes to me the power of people, and the power of people to gather, to create a voice, to have an opportunity to be protected, to work for their best interest. So,
I love that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Kerri, you're up.
Hi. So I have a personal connection to unions as well. My husband's grandfather was president of the Supermarkets Union in New York in the olden days. And so it's a big deal and my parents were teachers, so it's a big deal in our house as well. And that's kind of my journey. I'm going to defer to Professor Meyer's description of what they are. I think, to me, unionization represents the leveraging of the collective voice to try to balance out the inherently uneven distribution of power between the employing entity, or the employers, and the many otherwise disenfranchised, diffuse voices of the employees.
Excellent. And the same question, since you come from that, what does the union symbolize to you?
I just said it.
Oh, you're gonna no.
That was it. The leveraging of the collective voice.
Okay.
The joining together in order to balance out the unequal distribution of power.
Excellent. Ali, what about you?
About that? Yeah. So for me, when I think about unions, and just I like to contextualize it in the broader labor movement, which is to say, when we think of how workers can come together to ultimately have a stronger voice when they stand united against working conditions that may be exploitative, that may be undermining their not just their economic well-being, but also the economic well-being of a lot of their families. And so unions, to me, are one form of being able to have some type of collective action with workers. But I will certainly put the asterisk that it's not exclusive to unions, that there are other forms of being able to bargain collectively as well. And to me, the way that I enter this space is largely from having worked a lot with unions, particularly in Miami, the SEIU 32BJ union, that has been a pivotal organization in terms of pushing campaigns like the 5 for 15 campaign and improving other living wage ordinances throughout the state.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing. So there's a lot of great stickies here. And so there's a lot of to protect workers, fight for the working class. What does the process look like to define what those rights are, and understanding that this could be, different from each type of union, but who says what the rights are in those different contracts? And if you could just take us through that process.
In the process of negotiations, the idea and the notion is that the rights of workers need to be protected, that a contract needs to suss out what is fair and equitable to the people it is covering. It needs to include things that are going to make sure that should something happen to a worker, that they still can keep their job. For example, getting pregnant and having a child. You get pregnant and have a child, and you take maternity leave, that could be in a contract, so that when you are done with your maternity leave, A, it's spelled out that you get the right to take a maternity leave, and for how long it is, and then B, that when your maternity leave is over, you are coming back to a job that is the same job that you left. So the priorities become the priorities of the people who are in the industry. Safety may be the number one priority for folks who are working in trades. It depends, but all of the things get covered as much as possible, but not all things go in a contract, because depending upon the way management argues their case or what they tend to agree to, it's a slow process.
Excellent. Kerri,
The final contract is called the collective bargaining agreement, and the process by which you arrive at those terms and conditions is called collective bargaining. And as Professor Meyer stated, you have due process protections so that you're guaranteed, it provides a certain predictability. So if something goes awry, you know what the process, what the protocol is going to be. You know you're going to be handled the same way as everyone else. You know you're entitled to be heard at certain points or given a certain number of warnings or whatever the issue is. In terms of guarantees, in terms of leave, as she was saying, or safety, or whatever is paramount, important to your job that you will need, that is spelled out, so it becomes a vested right that you have instead of just something that the employer can deign to give you if he or she wishes. And that's very important as well. And the process of collective bargaining is supposed to be a good faith process with voices on both sides of the table. Again, negotiating in good faith and with a weapon, with an arsenal of weapons behind them, but not necessarily deployed at one another at all times. And I'll turn it over to our third panelist here.
What we're going to do is I'm going to go ahead and ask this next question, and Ali, I'm going to throw it to you first, and then we'll kind of bring it around here, which I think is a great question. So, and I'm going to expand on it a little bit more as well, but the question in its pure form is, can race impact union organizing, and as well, I guess, as any minority subset group, can that impact that process?
This is actually one of the key issues within the current labor movement today, as well as within current labor policy, not just locally, but really nationwide. Unions and policymakers don't really adequately account for the racial hierarchies that exist in most workplaces. This is, when we think of something like recent legislation that was introduced, the PRO Act, which is largely looking to strengthen unions and collective bargaining across the U.S. It's a legislative bill that was ultimately, that hasn't been passed yet, that was introduced by during the last legislative session. However, if you read that bill, there is some sort of there is an approach to think of labor law as race neutral, where in reality, when we think of the labor movement historically, we know that it has been historically unequal when it comes to being exclusive of women, being exclusive of people of color. While a lot of that has changed, the actual mechanism, the actual practices of unions haven't necessarily adopted to the modern economy, that it is much more diverse, not just racially and demographically, but certainly, again, culturally and also in terms of just the variance in how local economies and local communities ultimately can structure collective bargaining. And so moving forward, it really behooves policymakers as well as unions and other workers to be much more race conscious and have greater awareness of the different cultural complexities associated with collective bargaining. And this is something where, again, that opens the door that actually could be a great opportunity and a great strength of the future labor movement, being able to leverage some of these local communities that have perhaps predispositions towards collective action that are not necessarily exclusive to unions.
So I teach employment law as well as labor law, and that deals with employment discrimination. So I want to just remind everybody that there are federal and local statutes in place to prevent racial discrimination or any minority protected class status discrimination or harassment, and that those are tools that are always available to employees no matter what. So that's something that's important to remember. I'd also add that under the National Labor Relations Act, which is the statute that governs the formation of unions and the regulation of employee union activity and that entire realm, there are prohibitions against the exploitation or inflammation of racial prejudices in the process of organizing, and that those are important to keep in mind. And some of those cases are quite, upsetting and shocking, and the way, because again, when you're involved in a campaign to unionize, things are pretty volatile usually anyway. So to the extent that one of the sides chooses to exploit or prey upon racial prejudices in order to capture minds and hearts, that's intolerable under numerous federal statutes. But I would point to the NLRA, I would point to Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So in that sense, any kind of negative deployment of racial prejudice would be forbidden. Professor Meyer.
I would say that we tend to think of unions as starting during the Industrial Revolution by mostly white folk, and our earliest organizing in this country came as a result of indigenous folks gathering together in order to protect themselves. And so if we can look back on our history and pay attention to who were the originators of this kind of movement or these kinds of movements across the country, then absolutely race is a part of the narrative. It's also a part of what is protected in contracts. And so discrimination, like she said, it's protected, but it also is inclusive in contracts in addition to being protective. We have a Title IX question in our that we're dealing with currently in our bargaining that we're doing now, and the statement was made, was suggested that we remove the protection of a certain thing because of Title IX. And our stance was, no, we're going to leave it in there because Title IX can change. And if Title IX changes, we won't get that back. So we are going to, we're leaving it in the contract as a result, so.
No, that's awesome. And I'm going to jump back over to Professor Stone for a second, where you said there's federal and state laws, right, that protect us. So why would I care about a union if I have federal and state law on my side?
So again, to the extent that you have individual protections, you carry those with you always. If you are sexually harassed or racially harassed or anything, turned down for a promotion, you'll hire an attorney, you'll move forward with your case. You have every right to do that. You can vindicate your rights. But generally speaking, in terms of, I always tell my students, the human brain is like a big rubber band ball, and there's all kinds of strands of thought and perceptions and conscious thoughts and unconscious thoughts, and there's so much that goes into workplace relationships, dynamics, and regulation, that when you're looking at decisions that affect the group, that affect the collective, or that can be agreed upon by the group and then be applied to the individual, such as a disciplinary proceeding, locking down and having those things in writing, having that guarantee from the employer, this is how you're going to be treated, this is the process you're going to be put through, this is what we promise you at a bare minimum. There's value to that as it is spread across the board. So moving from that individual claim to the interests of the group as a whole, it's sort of a seamless extension of the rights and privileges and security that workers are able to enjoy in the workplace because of not only the federal protections and local and state protections afforded, but because of the power of that collective voice as it was deployed and wielded to extract those additional guarantees.
Excellent. Ali, is there something you'd like to add to that?
Great. Yeah, the only thing I just certainly mention is that when you really think of not just the labor movement, but in terms of where American labor policy is right now, there's there's been a historical weakening of a lot of existing labor protections, and particularly protections associated with collective bargaining when we think of the National Labor Relations Act. And even right now, the Supreme Court is reviewing a case in which the National Labor Relations Act can be significantly weakened by enabling states to ultimately preempt some of the protections associated with union practices and unions' ability to strike by enabling tort law to basically preempt some of the protections afforded from the National Labor Relations Act. And so I think the critical issue of what, the protections that unions can provide and the protections that that labor law as it currently exists provides, but there's also significant limitations in their reach because, again, of the scaling back of a lot of these protections over the past few decades, as well as the lack of resources really at the Department of Labor, as well as the National Labor Relations Board, that really hinders the ability of administrative agencies to enforce a lot of labor laws.
Martha, anything else you'd like to add to that? What was the question? If we have federal and state laws to protect us,
Why do we need a union?
why do we need the union?
Because I don't want to get fired if I show up late to work. I don't want my niece, who's a female graduating in engineering, to not be able to be protected, because the males in the unit get certain privileges that she doesn't get. So the protections that come from a union are for everybody. They are designed for everybody. And in particular, those most vulnerable of the population in the industry. So in academia, those most vulnerable will be women of color. And so when we look at something like student evaluations at the end of the semester, we know we have research, right? This is not Martha Meyer's opinion. This is research-backed. We know that they tend to get lower student evaluations because they are women of color. And so we have a contract that says, in order to evaluate a faculty member, these things must be taken into account. So it's not just one thing. And so that is a protection that is not only awarded me, it's awarded every other faculty member, whether they're in the union or they're not in the union. So if we don't have that collective power to be able to protect ourselves from things like showing up late to work, federal laws, and it doesn't matter.
Okay, so I have a statement here, and I'm going to say that this reads to the dark side of my heart because I'm all about a historical scandal. So this was a great one. Says unions were infiltrated by the mob to blackmail government.
They absolutely were.
Let's talk about that. What's going on with that? I'm going to start with you because you nodded yes. So tell us a little bit about that role, because I think that adds to the negative conception sometimes of what unions can do, because it's that historical narrative there.
It wasn't just the government, it was to empower themselves in order to to empower themselves, right? Like, it was about making sure that the money was going into their pockets versus going into the pockets of others. And it was also to make sure that the work that was being done by particular groups of individuals in order for the head of those groups to live a life that was way beyond the means of the people that he was actually trying to protect. So it's been, we have a dirty past in some places, but it's not everywhere, right? It's like one of those, like, you think about Chicago and unions, you think about New York and unions, and you have some really great stories to talk about. But, you don't have that in Miami with a, fraternal order of police. They're not like running around like picking up bad guys and getting extra cash for it, because it's not how it works. But yeah, we do have some historically fun stories, it's like a family. Everybody has a closet. This is part of the union closet.
It's part of the union closet. Is there something you'd like to add to that, Kerri?
Just that, in the early days before the passage of the NLRA, workers got together and joined a collective, Workers got together, joined their voices together, and engaged in certain protective activities. They would, if it was cold in the plant, they would organize a walkout. If, they didn't get a raise in a couple of years, they would engage in different disruptive activities. And I just want to point out that in the very early days before the passage of this law, which protected and fomented an environment in which unions could grow, you really had the perception on the part of society and the government and the press and everyone else who was perceiving what was going on, that these early organizers were themselves sort of criminals, engaged in criminal conspiracies, criminal enterprises. There were indictments. So one of the earliest roles of the NLRA was to change the perception that, hey, they're just trying to make things even. They're just trying, because if you start off with an employer that has this concentration, this immense concentration of power. Sorry, it's distracting. I don't let my students do phones and computers. Do you guys do that? I'm sorry. Okay, no, it's like distracting for me. I'm not used to this. All right. If you have this immense concentration of power in one place, and it's the employer, and they run everything, if someone's cold, they're like, good, go. We'll find someone else. We'll bring someone else in. We'll replace you. And you can do that over and over and over again. And there's a never-ending supply of people who are desperate and want to work and want to feed their families. And the systemic exploitation of that endless stream of workers was such a powerful force that the organizers had to work against, that they had to be disruptive. So I would point out that from the very early days, there was this casting, this framing of union activity as criminal conspiracy. Wow. And so one of the earliest roles when the NLRA was passed was to say, hey, this is okay. We're going to regulate it. There's going to be limits on it. Yeah. But there's a weapon of arsenals that the employer has, an arsenal of weapons that the employer has, and an arsenal of weapons that the employees have. And we're going to define them, and we're going to unpack this, and we're going to talk about it, and everyone's going to have resort to different things when things get rough, because there's a lot of them. And if they join together, you can't just easily keep replacing them as they freeze to death. So that's something I would add to that.
That's awesome. Ali, is there something you'd like to add to that?
Yes, absolutely. Currently, we talk about monopsony employer power in terms of, employers having disproportionate power in the labor market so that they can actually set labor conditions relatively unilaterally. However, if we were to go back, as Professor Stone kind of mentioned, if you go back several decades back, the emergence of the American labor movement really came about because corporations were using the government as really as a police force to really push back against workers demanding better working conditions. And so there has been, I think, a bad rap given to unions over the years as seeing so much of what workers and what worker collectives do as illegal or as unsanctioned collective action or strikes, when in reality it's been really, again, a considerable pushback against corporations that have historically used many resources at their disposal, particularly their influence with policymakers in order to really set the standard and the status quo associated with what working conditions should be.
So someone has to reduce inequality. So if we know that unions do all these great things and go beyond the federal and state kind of protections, why doesn't every company have it? Like, why doesn't every job or industry have a union?
Yes, and I think I kind of pointed to that in the beginning. It's the main reason is because labor law is so weak that it actually makes unionization extremely difficult for most folks. We're actually seeing that right now when we look at whether it's Starbucks unionization efforts or Amazon warehouses unionization efforts. These are efforts that that when they succeed, it's despite the fact that they're going against not just their own management, but oftentimes against even the entire corporation. Particularly in the context of Starbucks, we currently exist in a moment in time where labor law regulates how workers can ultimately form a union and what protections are afforded to them. But at the same instance, it does very little to prevent employers from actively pushing back against unionization efforts and pushing back, and so much so that, one, if an employer were to fire you for trying to unionize your workplace, there are legal protections for that. However, what the ramifications for their actions, it isn't a huge fine. It's not going to be any kind of it's not going to be a civil matter. If it goes to the National Labor Relations Board, you'll just get reinstatement into your old job. So there's really this huge incentive for employers to play outside of the lines of the National Labor Relations Act and other kind of legislation that regulates unions in a way that workers can't necessarily do the same.
Excellent, thank you. Martha. Why?
I'm paying attention to the response, not the question.
I feel hurt. No, okay, so why don't we have unions everywhere? Why aren't there, if these are so great and they protect us above federal and state law, why, I want, my workplace to always have that, equality.
Indeed you do.
I do.
Indeed you do.
Indeed I do.
Indeed you do. I think the simplest answer is the balance of power and where the power lies. And the power lies, until the collective becomes the collective, the power lies with the administration and with the managers and with the people who sign the paychecks. And so it is very difficult to convince a line worker that voting for a union is going to be better for them when they have management who has control of everything, right? Again, show up late, get fired. And so there is a fear that is connected to that whole process of being able to organize. But how many of you in here have ever seen the movie Ants? Excellent. So those of you who've seen it will understand that. If not, I'm going to do my best to describe this scene. So the story's about a little worker ant, right? And I think he falls in love with the princess ant or whatever it is, and he wants to be able to do whatever he wants to do. He doesn't want to be a worker ant. It's kind of like this one of the Christmas movies. So he starts convincing the people, right? The other little ants to walk off the job and not do the work and do this other thing. This is an animated movie, by the way, not a real movie. They're actually talking in the movie. The big mean grasshopper.
Oh,
Thank
that's
you.
Bugs Life, though. That's Bugs Life, not Ants.
No.
No, Bugs Life, Pixar, yes,
No,
Brian.
this is ants.
Bugs Life.
If it's about ants, you're not.
No, there's ants there, you're right.
Okay, so the movie's not ants?
It's Bugs Life, Bugs Life.
Whatever.
And it was the hopper, they were getting ready to fight the hopper.
But they all raised their hands. They said they'd seen it.
But,
Okay,
so
it's
we're
all
there.
right. It's no big deal.
We're there.
The
We're
point's
there, we're
the
there.
same.
Yes.
The point is the same. So they try to, walk off the job, and the big grasshopper, one of the little dumb grasshoppers says, what's the big deal if a couple of ants don't go on here? And he's like, it's not one or two that we have to matter. And then he turns and he points, and all the ants come rushing out of the anthill. And he's like, it's when they all get together. And so unions are that. Yep. Unions are all of the ants getting together to stand up for themselves and have conditions that are workable, right? We got unions in the early 1900s because parents didn't want their kids to have to crawl into machines anymore and lose limbs. So we organized during the Industrial Revolution so that we could have people together, and we had working wages for families so that their kids could go to school and the cycle of poverty could be broken. So the reason we don't have it is because people are afraid of the managerial response.
So I'm going to piggyback off of that for a second, because I think it goes beyond fear too, though. It's an idea and concept of trust.
Yeah.
Right? You're asking me to trust my coworker, and I don't trust my coworker with anything.
Right.
Right? Like, I don't know you, so why? I'm not gonna trust my wages, my livelihood, and then what if you sell out? Like, so I'm here doing all the things, signing all the papers, all the little pickets, and then you're crossing the line, and then who looks bad? So how does an organization or a group of people begin to cultivate that trust, to even begin to have a conversation about, like, maybe we can come together and
Because you organize around an idea. You organize around a particular situation that has gone awry. Maybe it's wages, maybe it's working conditions, maybe it's time off, maybe it's paid leave, maybe it's something. So you organize around something that reaches the most people. And when you can do that, you then now have a collective who is in agreement about something, and we can work on agreeing about the other things. And you have people who are representing you. So you pick the people who are going to lead this, right? So I may not trust you,
No, you shouldn't.
but I trust her, right? So I'm gonna vote for her, because I don't trust you.
You shouldn't. You shouldn't. No, and I think that that's an important piece, right? Because when we think of, we don't really see, I'm going to make myself super young right now, even though I'm super old. But you don't really hear a lot of that idea. If I go right now into the job market to look for a job, I don't say like, oh, this place has a union. Like, that's the last. That's like, how much do they pay? Do I get time off to go do this? Do I get to work remotely? The last thing I look for is if there's this extra layer of protection. So where do you see the future of unions going if we're, again, I'm young again, if we're the future of unions, right? But that is not the top of our priority list. Where do you see what unions will look like in 10, 15, 20 years from now? Ali, you shook your head on that one, so I saw that.
Yeah. I think the panel just mentioned a lot of great issues and challenges associated with unionization, with labor movements, and this is like a critical this idea of like a collective action problem, right? That we don't want anybody free riding, or that there's a huge there's like a significant barrier to actually get the peak amount of folks to try to ultimately form a union. And so one of the things that can ultimately address a lot of that is sectoral bargaining, which is basically having collective bargaining and having wages and benefits set at the industry level. And that's where I think the hope would be that we can move closer to that. And realistically, it's not too far off. Not obviously, it's sectoral bargaining is available in a lot of European countries, where let's say like where there's collective bargaining for the entire automotive industry, for example, irrespective of what employer you are, irrespective of what position in the company that you have. But we can also see something like within the Build Back Better framework, there were a lot of regulations and investments associated with the care industry, particularly around childcare. And one of the big things that was going to happen had Build Back Better passed in its initial iteration was actually setting wages for care workers throughout the country, and making sure that even if you were just a child care center, that when you care for adolescent children, that you're getting basically compensated at a rate similar to an elementary school teacher, as an example. And so the reason why that was proposed in Build Back Better, it's because I think it really points to a very critical problem in our economy right now, which is that absent sometimes a top-down approach to setting appropriate labor standards and labor protections is really critical. And I think as we see with the pandemic, and as we'll move, we're now in a really in a moment in history where we're just going to see a lot more crises happening over the next few years. We're going to see the necessity to actually have these kind of all-encompassing, comprehensive approaches to stabilize certain industries, and particularly stabilize the protections and regulations associated with how workers are compensated.
I think unions get a bad rap. I think they really do, and I think we shouldn't overlook or underestimate the efforts of employers to actively discourage unionization at times. And in our class, I teach a lot of the cases that revolve around some of these tactics and techniques. They range from covert surveillance of the workplace, of areas of the workplace you wouldn't expect to be covertly surveilled in when you're having, candid conversations with coworkers. And there's a lot of paranoia sown, there's a lot of fear sown, and I spoke before about the idea of limitations, right? So you have this arsenal of weapons, but you also have limitations. So one of the things we tell employers is you can't retaliate against people for unionizing, and you can't do certain things to them. And there's other things you can't do, but at a certain point, if you're just like, okay, I'm done, this isn't worth it anymore, I don't want to do this anymore, you can move your plant. You can farm out your work. You don't have to stay open in that location. And at that point, it's not you firing, Susie and Debbie, it's just you shutting down, and they're not going to have jobs anymore. And there's a lot of case law that really gets into the nuances of the difference between a threat and a prediction. So here's what could happen, guys. Like, we're on your side. You want to work with us? Yeah. And there's a lot of this dance that gets done. So there's a lot of forces actively working to just, so in answer to the earlier question about what's going on, why don't we have this everywhere? Because not everybody thinks it's so great. And there are a lot of seeds being sown about, this could be a minefield.
And I would add that if you are young and looking for a job, and one of the things you're looking at is salary and days off and insurance and all those other things, be warned that that can be taken away if unions become undermined. Because those things exist because of labor unions. So you getting 2 weeks vacation paid, 3 weeks vacation paid, top-tier insurance that you don't have to pay for, maternity leave, those kinds of things. Those exist because there are unionized industries that won that first. And so I could go work in the auto workers or the farm workers somewhere and be protected and have those things given to me because there is a collective. Or I can work for another person who says, well, unions don't really have any more power away, so we're going to take away your maternity leave. We're going to take away your paid vacation. We're going to take away this, that, and the other thing. You want to take a vacation? Take it on your own time. But what are you ever going to do? You're never going to take a vacation, which means now I have free labor.
Right.
So that's why.
So before I open up the floor for questions, really quick, and we'll start with Professor Stone, what is the one message, the one takeaway that you would like to impart to us young people here as we go along the day? Why are you in my face, friends? In my face, laughing in my face. Us young people, for us to, I'm a professional, laughing at us. What can we take with us to impart for the rest of the day as we process this about unions? Like what's the biggest message takeaway?
I always tell my students, at the end of the day, you work for yourself. Every job you're in, you may not stay in, you're collecting skills, you're collecting experiences, you're collecting relationships, you take your reputation with you from place to place. As you map out your career, as you figure out what you want to do, you need to educate yourself. And people use that phrase, do your own research, educate, it's so cliched. I really want to talk about what that means. It doesn't just mean surfing the internet or listening to what everyone else is listening to, but it really means getting into, learn about the history of this stuff. Read the fine print. I like more traditional sources. Read respected publications. Don't look at, I'll pick the New York Times over a YouTube video any day, given that choice. Really learn about what's going on and what forces are at work so that you can make intelligent decisions that benefit yourself and your career, so that if somebody else asks you a question, you become a resource and an authority and your information is accurate. If you're going to go into a field where this exists, I tell my law students, law firms traditionally are not, that's not a unionized workplace, but understand what the labor movement is, understand the ripple effects and the outer bands of ramifications, so that a lot of the stuff that goes on in the center does, as Professor Meyer said, they benefit you, so that you really understand how things work and the mechanism by which you get what you need, so you can vote in your own best interest, make decisions about union membership in your own best interest, that you're not capable in any direction of being fear-mongered or, oh, did you hear they want us to pay dues, it's going to be this much, oh, did you hear there's gossip they might shut down, oh, did you, and so, half the time you hear stuff and it's like, they're not even allowed to do that, but somehow everyone's talking about that, So just make sure that you really know what you're talking about, because all of your votes are important, whether they're votes about unionization, whether they're political votes, whatever you're doing, your vote is important, and you should really, I think, just work to educate yourselves by reading things thoroughly. I tell my students, even for class, I tell them, like don't be the, because the law school, we think a lot of ourselves over there, and I said, don't be like a Cliff Note person. Don't be. It's called Quimby in law school. They don't think we know that, but we know that. Because they always publish these quick and dirty versions if you don't have time to read the whole thing. And that's never what we're going to test. And that's never what real life doesn't test the quick and dirty version of anything. So if you're going to purport to know something, if you're going to cast a vote, just make sure you're reading all the fine print and you're educating yourself.
Excellent. Ali.
Yeah, I'll leave folks with a thought exercise that I oftentimes tell students. Think about, tomorrow's graduation day, right? Tomorrow, will you be that much more skillful, talented, wiser than you are the day before today? And the short answer is probably not. And yet tomorrow, having that credential is going to confer upon you a lot higher wages, a lot more job opportunities. That's just kind of where we are in the economy, where credentialization is really important. That being said, the takeaway is know what your work is worth, and irrespective of whether you have a degree or not, whether you have X amount of experience or not, I think we can all individually assess, what we can ultimately offer in terms of our work product, and if that isn't necessarily being reflected with your current employer or your potential employer, then there are many mechanisms, as we talked about, collective action being one of them, where you can actually try to push back and find ways that you're going to be adequately compensated.
Excellent.
I'm just quick and dirty. If you take away one thing from today, I would say that there is power in the collective. There is power in the collective voice. If you are going to be joining an industry that has a union, join it, because your protection doesn't only protect you, it protects other people like you. And that collective voice also includes voting. So vote, because if every college student would vote in an election, guess what? Politicians would pay attention to you, because there's power in the collective. So that's my quick and dirty.
Excellent. Are there any questions for the panel?
Ask it.
I have two questions. One, first, is what do you think that we could do to support local union efforts, and even in the small towns? So from the Starbucks and the workers and the warehouses and Amazon. But with that in mind, I have a real curiosity around why police unions are so successful and supported and stabilized in the same places. So we can take New York, for example, and the organizing around the warehouse for Amazon in Long Island. So the exact same neighborhood.
That's where I'm from.
Yeah, well, there you go. So the dichotomy between supporting and organizing unions that protect the working people in the same community, where a union protects police officers from being held accountable for their own state violence. How does that work out?
Why are you deferring to me?
Well, do you have, it's a great question. Do you have an
shaking his
explanation?
head.
Ali?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a great question, and I think what this ultimately points to is that there is a double standard. Like, not all unions are created equal, not all workers are created equal. When I say that, labor protections have been gutted over the past several decades, that applies to just basically about 99% of occupations and unions, including public sector unions. However, what that doesn't apply to is police unions. Police unions, even in the Florida legislature, as as labor protections continue to be scaled back, who's oftentimes excluded? Police unions, and what that basically again ultimately creates is a bit of an insidious partnership where there's oftentimes lack of oversight, lack of any kinds of ability to actually have greater accountability over these kind of organizations, and the answer is ultimately, how do you make sure that you bring police unions really in line with broader worker protections that everybody should be afforded to, right? There should not be a special case for one set of work for one given workforce compared to all of the workers. And so while the context of police unions is to me truly a perversion of what unions could be and should be. In fact, it's something very, very different than the kinds of labor unions that we've known to be extremely useful in terms of promoting local economic development and creating greater inclusivity and equity in many communities.
Thank you.
I'll take a stab at that
Yeah,
too.
of course.
So I would say one, because you gave me a minute to think about it, and I think it's a great question. I think first of all, momentum. I think there are certain occupations that have a tradition of, and I think firefighters, I think police officers, there's a strong tradition, so it's just sort of accepted, versus where there's nothing, you have to put it into place and you have to kind of sell the idea. But I also think, as the New York Times said, and we all read that for this week, the two biggest threats to unionization and to the collective voice of workers are globalization and technology. And I think if you think about policing, that's most resistant to those things. Like, what are you going to do? Like the cop on the beat, like you're not going to farm it out to another continent, and you're not going to replace them, hopefully, with technology. Well, you're not going to replace them with technology, you can aid them with it. But so I think there's an inherent unspoken strength sort of that inheres in that, where they know, like, they need us. What are they going to do? Like, the house is on fire. What are you going to do? So I think there's an element of that, and I think it can be very destabilizing, I think, for Starbucks workers and Amazon workers to constantly be told about this could be done differently, that could be done differently, we could bring this in, we could bring that in, you could be replaced. And I think that's probably part of it too.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Thank you so much. And first, before we close out, thank you all that wrote questions. We were able to guide and have these conversations because you asked your questions, gave your input, gave us the historical scandal with the mafia. I loved it. So thank you so much. And thank you, Global Learning, for having us here and conducting these panels. And for the panelists, of course, thank you so much.
It is 1:30, so if you've scheduled us in between class, I absolutely understand if you need to sneak out. But thank you so much for being here. And again, one more time, thank you for this wonderfully esteemed panel. The conversation continues. We will still be in this space, so if you want to hang out and you have any additional questions, you're more than welcome to do so. Otherwise, it was an absolute pleasure to have you all. Feel free to join us again next week. It'll be our very last TTR when we'll welcome the deputy. I can't read his thing from here. He is the Director of Worker-Owned Enterprises from Catalyst Miami, doing a session on building more democratic economies, how cooperatives shift powers to communities. So thank you so much, and we'll see you again soon. Have a nice day.
Thank you, Ali. It was nice.